Good afternoon. Liz Plater-Zyberk here. I've been asked to moderate a panel which has gotten to be somewhat more complex since the program was printed. And the speakers will be coming to the podium in this order, and Daigle first, presenting the position of the Prince's Foundation, Bill Browning second, and then the late additions, Steve Mouzon, third, and Dan Sloan, fourth. And each person will do a quick introduction of themselves, their work, and their position. Come forward, Anne. I just wanted to perhaps give one introductory comment. This was intended to be, first of all, this was intended to be a session with the discussion going on in the seminar room with the audience. This is not an easy kind of ambience for that, but hopefully, I think we can hear you. And so each person has promised to speak for 5 minutes, which means that we will have about 45 minutes for discussion, which is probably more than you've gotten in absolutely any other session. And then, second of all, in terms of the ideas behind this, I think the kind of duality or opposition that's been set up by the topic or the title, mechanical versus passive, is a bit of a red herring, because there's a catch-22 in this whole picture, and almost anything that we invent in some new way to deal with, this is my personal opinion, I should add, anything new we invent to deal with an older invention that's caused problems in terms of environmental issues comes along with its own set of problems. And I think most of us find ourselves in positions where making the decisions with any real rational underpinnings can be very difficult. And so hopefully we could get to that part of the discussion. And the easiest example is the incandescent light bulb uses energy, and so we've invented or been told that the fluorescent light bulb is more energy efficient. But of course there's a toxic waste issue that comes along with it that maybe is not as large as the incandescent bulb. And then the one thing I've never been able to understand is why I have an incandescent bulb in my house that has lasted for almost 40 years. And it has a slightly different shape than all the others, and I wonder whether it has something to do with the design of the bulb, and was that really the intention of the industry to make you keep buying this stuff? And it doesn't have to be that way, and wouldn't it be better maybe to make a better incandescent? And well, you can see where this is going. Anne?
Yes, and that's very interesting, planned obsolescence. Yes, I'm Anne Daigle, and I work with the Prince's Foundation. Used to be for the built environment, but now is called for building community. And we work on engaging, educating, and empowering communities. We work on projects, all different scales, from the community down to the block and to the building, working in a framework of community capital for building social, natural, built, and financial capital simultaneously in communities. At the heart of what we do is uncompromised commitment to sustainability. The Prince of Wales is extremely committed to that. We are working on putting together toolboxes for all these various levels. I'm going to show this slide because one of the things we're doing is research as part of education. And we have found that in the research, people think that when you talk about an eco house or something that's green, that it's going to be an abnormal look. They're not comfortable with the look of what they're seeing coming out of high tech. And that includes solar panels. But they do agree, and this is across all ages too, it's not just young, old, all ages, that if the house is, or the building is traditionally designed, that they would appreciate it better. I'm going to run through these because a lot of it is talking about the work that we do at those different levels, I was saying, from community building, at the master planning, to development, and to the house, because that's what we're talking about today, or, you know, is the building passive and active. But the natural house is a project that the Princess Foundation is working on to accommodate this idea of a traditionally built passive house that is very energy efficient and as close to possible approaches zero carbon. You can see the house here. It actually, the goal is to have fabric first, no plastic environment, but very thermally efficient, using highly permeable foundations, walls, roof, achieving that 70% improvement on building the current regulations as they stand in the UK in efficiency, 70% energy efficiency. Naturally breathable. There's actually, the house uses a thermoplan system that is fascinating. I didn't have the slide to put in here, but the section actually uses clay tiles that have the airspace in them. They use sheep and wood fiber insulation. There is no permeability around the edges of the house. You can see it's a very traditionally designed, very appealing system. It has a clay tile roof. I'm not going to go into all of the details of how it is put together, but you can see here that the thermal coherence of it keeps it warm in the wintertime and cool in the summer. The passive ventilation is important. I questioned it because when I was there, I live in New Orleans where we're also working on this. And New Orleans has a completely different temperature than they do in Wales. This is actually at the BRE. It's called the Innovation Park, the Building Research Center there. Establishment, right, BRE. But they do have, you know, it keeps out moisture, which would be critical, I think, for humidity, because I think humidity is the biggest issue. And as long as we have air movement, we're going to keep that. They're actually building what they're calling the Magnificent Eight, putting these houses together in a hamlet which is a regeneration of an oil refinery site called Coed Darcy in Wales, and incorporating all of these various, well, low-tech, they're really low-tech solutions. And let's see, here, this is something that I just added in here. There's another house that they're doing more experimentation on, using, again, the traditional forms, the idea of a thermoplan system where it traps the air, you know, in the clay walls. And this one has a hemp fiber insulation. And of course, lime plaster and renders with that clay tile roofing. And they're having good sales with the house already. This shows we're going on further with the foundation by actually teaching the traditional building skills to apprentices. And here are some of the apprentices that are working. We're actually thatching roofs in Wales and in other areas. Everything is being done on site using traditional building skills. The natural interiors of the house as well are made with all recyclable materials, using the gardens as well. So it is a fully sustainable approach to development, again done in the walkable community of a hamlet, or a full community of walkable mixed use in the area. And this is Rosetown. They're experimenting with these house forms all over the world in lots of different climates. So although it's very early right now, I do anticipate that we'll see a lot more of the results and the research of this as it comes through. I was over. You didn't tell me. Sorry.
How do I get it up? Yeah, you're good. Oh, good. Hi, I'm Bill Browning. I am a partner in a research and consulting firm called Terrapin Bright Green. We're based in Washington, D.C. and New York. Founding board member of the U.S. Green Building Council, and also have been the design director for a while for a new urbanist community, DPZ design community. So I got asked to take the high-tech argument here. So I'll play that game today. And I'll start with a building designed by two of the partners in my firm, Rick Cook and Bob Fox. Now, this represents the thinking of 10 years ago. It was the first LEED platinum skyscraper in the world. It uses about half the energy in the office tower of a conventional office building. It is daylit. It has the best indoor air quality in the city. People can control their own airflow and temperature at each desk. And it is a sealed glass box. It captures all the rainwater that falls on the building in cisterns and uses that in the fabric of the building. And it used a lot of locally sourced materials. It has a green roof on the flat section of the roof on the podium section between it and the other adjoining building, with the idea being that no matter where you are in the building, you could always look out and see some form of park or greenery. So either out to Bryant Park in the upper floors, out to Central Park, or out to the rivers and in the intermediate space to the green roofs between it and the adjoining building 4 Times Square. So that's one approach. An equally high-tech approach done a few years before that is an entirely naturally ventilated building done by Alan Short, the Queen's Building at De Montfort University. Now, Alan got very inspired by the work of Frank Furness, and so there are lots of references to Frank Furness and a feel to Willy Leduc in this. So this is an all-naturally ventilated engineering laboratory, workshops, classrooms, and offices for an engineering college within De Montfort University. Now, what Alan is finding, and the others are finding in the UK, is they are pushing to entirely naturally ventilated buildings, entirely daylit buildings. Not so much this, but the work of some other folks, is that you're getting into buildings where the surface to skin ratio is so high, you have so much surface area, and you're doing once pass through air with the natural ventilation, that the energy use of the buildings is actually quite high. Now that seems counterintuitive, but the reason is that you have a heating climate. And as you have all of this skin area and all of this air passing through just once, it means that you are putting an incredible amount of heating energy into these buildings. So let's go a middle path. This is a building that we worked on with HKS and Gensler, Flackenkurtz and Arup. This is a roughly 1 million square foot complex done for Lucasfilm in the Presidio. It is the largest mixed mode building in the U.S. This building can be run essentially naturally ventilated, but there are certain times and certain conditions when they don't want to do it that way. And so everything can be sealed and it can be run as a sealed building as well. This, while it's not going to get any prizes for beauty, is the most energy efficient building in the country right now. This is a building done for the National Renewable Energy Lab. It is the research support facility. It is an interesting building in that what they did was return to thinking about how do you do a large office building, 250,000 square feet, as a passive building as much as possible, and then just add in the mechanical systems necessary to support that operation. It's a net zero energy building in that photovoltaics provide all the electricity for the building, and over the course of the year, those photovoltaics generate more energy than the building consumes. And so that gets you to a net zero energy balance. Architecturally, not my favorite, but in terms of performance, this building sets a new record for buildings in the United States, including the data centers. The measured energy performance is under 35 kilowatt, under 35,000 BTUs per square foot per year. Take out the data centers and they'd actually be under 25. So let's sort of contrast that then with three different houses, a couple of which are fairly old. First is Amory Lovin's house that I helped build as an architecture student, and then worked with Amory for 17 years after that. This is his house in Snowmass, Colorado. It was actually the inspiration for the entire passive house movement. It is a passive house, super insulated with solar. It now is a net zero energy house in that all the systems in the house, the backup heating, the cooking and everything is done with electricity supplied by photovoltaics. It's naturally ventilated. It has R40 walls and R60 roof, and windows ranging from R9 to R18. In Los Angeles is this recycled steel box done by John Picard in the late 90s, early 90s. It is a mechanical approach. It's in an easy climate. It is net zero energy as well. It meets the street wall of the surrounding neighborhood, although it's substantially taller than the other buildings. One of the neighbors originally described it as the box that the other houses on the street were delivered in. Then below that is a house done in the mid-90s in Sarasota by the Florida House for Sustainable Living, and now called Florida House. This is also a mixed mode building. This house, using local vernacular, can be run as a pretty much all naturally ventilated house. When weather conditions in Sarasota get too nasty, too hot, too humid, you can seal it up and run systems in it. But because of the design and thinking about excluding too much sunlight in and all the other features that make it as efficient as possible to work as a natural house, the systems wind up being much, much smaller than you would find in a conventional house. And so that, along with the Enroll building, really for us points what we think is probably the best direction, is do the buildings as passive as possible. Because even in the nastiest climates like New Orleans, where we do a lot of work, there are good chunks of the year when the house can be entirely passive. And then when you do need the mechanical systems, they're an addition. They're smaller, and they don't have to do as much work and use a lot less energy.
We're good. Hi, my name is Steve Mouzon. I'm an author of a book called The Original Green a couple of years ago, which is the reason I'm here. We've got a system, or actually several systems, the most prominent, of course, being the USGBC's LEED, that actually is based primarily on a mechanical view of conditioning. It is an additive system, which means that you can kind of pick and choose where you want to get the credits. And it does have a strong prejudice towards what I call gizmo green solutions. For example, you can, and there's also this whole issue of with preservation, that you get almost as many points for a bike rack as you do for preserving an entire building. The idea of the original green is basically that this is the system of sustainability that kept humans alive really for almost all of human history until the thermostat age began some time ago. It works like this. It begins with the proposition that we must first of all build sustainable places before it makes any sense to talk about green buildings. Those places should be nourishable, accessible, serviceable, and securable. then those buildings should be lovable, durable, flexible, and frugal. So what I'm going to talk about here primarily is just the frugality aspect, or entirely just the frugality aspect. Gizmo Green is the proposition that with better equipment and better materials we can achieve sustainability. That is part of the solution, but it's not the entire thing. It also has a problem in that a lot of the people that were talking about wanting to do green buildings prior to the meltdown have now said, you know, we don't have the budget for that. Let's get rid of all the green stuff and just do a bare bones building, because the problem is better equipment does cost more money generally, and better materials do cost more money as well. I've charted out here the aspects of each of these that we know how to do, and there's some holes there, obviously. I want to point out that in frugality, Gizmo Green does have a role to play. Okay, it really does, but it's not the primary part of frugality. Unfortunately, almost all of the national discussions about sustainability are all about Gizmo Green, and so they're missing the big picture. So I've got 8 game changers I want to speak briefly about here. These are general principles that have wide applicability across a range of particulars. On the left is what we've done for the entire history of the thermostat age. That is, we design a building, wrap some kind of skin around it, the style doesn't matter, and then we call in the engineers to size the loads and the equipment and then hang thermostats on the walls, so we condition the buildings first. On the right-hand side is actually an older method that works even better. Basically, first of all, do you see anybody suffering in that picture? Okay, nobody's suffering, are they? You know, they're sitting out on the streets of Paris having an espresso or whatever. What they're also doing, whether they realize it or not, is they're conditioning themselves to the local environment, so that when they return indoors, that they actually may not need any conditioning at all. And of course, the most efficient piece of equipment obviously is that which is off. Okay, because it doesn't matter how efficiently you're running, if you're running, you are consuming some energy. So how do we do that? Well, the first thing, we need to entice them out into a great public realm. Now, New Urbanists ought to be absolutely championing this, because we're the ones that have been creating the great public realms for years. And then we need to be enticing them out into great private realms as well. When we do this, then that leads to a condition that I call living in season, that's similar to eating in season, where you're eating the food that's coming into season at the time. That when you're living in season, you can actually throw the windows open for most of the year. Now, not on the most extreme days, you know, the hottest days and the coldest days, you won't do that. The next game changer is building smaller and smarter. I was one of several dozen architects involved in the Katrina Cottages initiative after the storm. This is one of the ones that I designed as a model on display in Washington, D.C. We learned a lot of lessons from that, and it's a timely thing, because since the end of World War II until now, we basically are building houses twice as large when the household is actually half as large. So you actually have 4 times as much space per person. I've participated as well. This is a house that we built back in the 1980s. It was 3,000 feet. So, you know, I've done the same thing as well. I will say this. The house for the first several years actually had no conventional heating and cooling systems at all. It was completely passive. Finally, we decided to put in a geothermal system for the most extreme days of the year. But really, okay, and then one thing I should say about that, we really struggled to just put sheetrock on the walls, and on that one, you know, a young architect's salary right out of school. This is our condo at South Beach now. Obviously, the finishes are nicer. But the reason is it's only 1/4 as large. So in this area of frugality, small really is the new luxury. The next thing back to this house is the idea of light wings. No part of this house was more than 20 feet thick, and so therefore that makes daylighting and cross ventilation a breeze. Similar to the fact that highly processed food is not so good for you. Highly processed materials can be sort of thought of in the same way as well. It takes like 500,000 BTUs to create a pound of aluminum. Now, the stuff on the right is not energy free, but it does use less. You know, we talk a lot about recycling, and recycling is good. But in terms of buildings, it's far better to reuse the building rather than deconstruct it, use the plumbing over here, the lights over there, and the boards over there, or whatever. Back to the Katrina Cottages, one thing we discovered is that if you want to build radically smaller and smarter, then you need to have single things that do multiple jobs as opposed to multiple things doing single jobs like the many places that you can eat in a McMansion. We really need to rethink a lot of our interior layout conventions. When I first went to work for an architect, one of his rules was no windows on the bed wall, but over the years, some of the most delightful bedrooms I've ever woke up in, like this one, have light streaming right across the pillows. What I also noticed is that the more sides you can put windows on, the smaller the room can be. For example, my friend Eric Moser designed a house in Habersham that has a bedroom that's 8 feet by 9 feet, but the kids are fighting over who gets to sleep there because it has windows on 3 sides. Bottom line is we want to put buildings back to work for the first time in 100 years. You know, our buildings have been unemployed for about that long in their own conditioning. And actually, some of the most charming things about the old buildings was the ways, the techniques for conditioning themselves. The thing in the middle is a light modulation device. The thing that's on the outsides are air modulation devices. So we want to be frugal naturally first, and then, just as we heard a moment ago, bridge the gap with equipment that is more efficient, but that also can be smaller because it's not so loaded. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dan Sloan with McGuire Woods. I am on a number of boards, Green Roofs for Healthy Cities. I'm on the board of the Congress for the New Urbanism. I represent the World Green Building Council. I live in the world between urbanism and sustainability. And so I'm going to pick up on a theme that's recurring here, and that is the notion of the passive and vernacular at the beginning and then bridge the gap. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the context. And I'm going to talk about different points that have come up as we've tried to negotiate these different views and different positions, among them being that not everybody believes that photovoltaics are not and cannot be beautiful. I've seen photovoltaics in Tuscany, I've seen them in the Caribbean, and we have a wide range of materials available today, and so I don't buy the proposition that that's not one of the available aesthetics that we can utilize. There's another aspect of this that may define something of the place that I and many of the people I work with come from, and that is that the target at the end of the day has to be not just net zero, but regenerative. And that is, we are at a point where, if you just were to look at heating and cooling, well, that's relatively easy. But in fact, we're filling our houses with TVs and computers, and we're recharging our cars, and we're doing a whole lot of things that basically mean that we have to be going far beyond just not having a negative footprint with our house itself. So the challenge is that 70% isn't good enough, 90% isn't good enough, even 100% isn't good enough as we move forward, and we have to figure out how we carry our weight on the world. And that's an incredible challenge that almost no one has been able to meet, and it takes a lot of different techniques now to get there and not do absurd things to the space that we occupy. And it means that we'll probably also be more, this conversation is almost already outdated because we are already talking about how we can't achieve those things with the single building, the single office building, the single house, and that in fact it's only in systems that we can accomplish these, and thinking beyond the house into the district, into the block, and doing the things that actually new urbanists do very well. In that context, we're talking about the future of humans. It's kind of fundamental, both for the context in which they live, as Steve rightly points out, but also whether they'll live. We also have to be very aware of our market. The challenge for environmentalists is we've been to some of these places before, and the sort of hair shirt environmentalism, you ought to achieve good by basically being terribly uncomfortable, hasn't sold very well. There is a market for that. There's a sort of eco-warrior market that's really cool and it's fun to work with, but it doesn't describe the mainstream market very well. And when we talk about retraining the market, it takes a very, very long time, and it's an important part of it, and I'll come back to that because that aspect of human behavior is important. We also have to understand both the place as amenity and the home itself as amenity, and how it feels to be there. So this discussion is really important in setting the context of the place that we occupy. We also have to talk about costs, not just the upfront capital costs, but the operating costs over time. And this influences how much technology, what kinds of technology, but also whether I'm going to have ongoing systems costs, grid costs, those sorts of things. And one of the things that is increasingly coming up as part of the discussion is human behavior. One of the advantages of passive systems is that if done correctly, they function without humans having to be good about how they behave. One of the challenges of some technologies is that they can be overridden by bad human behavior. But we're getting increasingly good at data feedback loops and really understanding how to incentivize people to optimize the settings in which they're existing. So there are a lot of things going on at once. And correctly identified one of the biggest problems, humidity. And I want to talk for a moment about humidity because that is where some of my clients have reached their maximum challenge. And I'll take New Orleans. I have a client who builds in New Orleans. He builds essentially thermos bottles. He doesn't like for you to open the windows because when you open the windows, you create a problem for him. You open the window because it's a nice, pleasant evening, and you basically change the next 2 weeks of the operation of that house. And when you close that window with all the humidity that you've let in that fills the books in the house, the furniture in the house, the drapes in the house, not only will he spend more money on the energy to, in the next couple of weeks, to return that house to its most efficient level, but you'll also probably start growing mold because as you now throw cold air against that setting, and warm air against that setting and change the circumstances, you'll grow mold. So he is hostile to humidity. And as we've sort of negotiated, what we've talked about, there's got to be an equation here. There's some equation that says, there's some amount of time I can leave the windows open that makes sense from the energy savings from not operating anything at all that deals with the increased costs of actually running dehumidification. And in fact, those equations are out there, and you can reach a point where you say, well, overnight might not make sense, but if I'm at a point in the season where 2 weeks of having an open window makes sense, that may make sense. So that's a point of commonality in there. I also just want to point out we're not dealing necessarily with climates in which three seasons of the year can you leave windows open. We also have to deal with very hot and very cold places, and that goes back to market. We have increasing problems with air pollution. When we talk about these things in Beijing, they look at us like we're crazy when we talk about opening the windows. It's the last thing they want. We got to fix another problem before we can open those windows. We've got agreement, I think, on incorporating the vernacular. And in many cases, the quarrel is not with the green community. It's a quarrel amongst the styles and designs. It's a quarrel that pits the sort of box of a modernist that uses a high tech to overcome a lot of glass or any number of sort of challenges that really don't necessarily occur when you're talking to people currently working on green buildings, because they're looking for passive first and then technologies after that. But it is driven in many cases by their stylistic allies. And the notion that buildings shouldn't be rendered unusable. And this is a really important bill. Bill moved our discussion to some of the hardest places, which is our bigger buildings, multifamily, those sorts of things. And there certainly have been circumstances in the world. India stood out. One of the very first platinum buildings in India had inoperable windows in a place where the power went off almost every day. So, how much sense does that make? It doesn't make any sense at all. And then one final note of an alliance. There are many ways in which we cross over in these discussions, but one of them is an increasing conversation of resilience in an era of volatile climate and tornadoes, hurricanes, volatile circumstances, interrupted power. This notion of resilient communities, so communities designed so after the hurricane you can still occupy the buildings, you can still function in them. I think that's something all of our speakers have come back to, is the importance of buildings' ability to when the power shuts off and when certain things happen, for them to keep going forward. And when you interject that side of the current green discussions, you find a lot of familiar discussions, familiar technologies that are daylighting, passive. They're all designed to deal with the circumstance in which we try to keep in mind the notion that we have to continue to occupy these areas in times when it may not be the easiest. Finally, I'll say one of the things that's really not dealing with in this discussion yet are the challenges to the aesthetics that come from green walls, green building, green roofs, and an increasing intervention and sort of melding of landscape and building, which is a wonderful environmental tool, but an aesthetic challenge for some people as to how that interaction occurs. So I think we are sort of set up for the version of compromise discussion, and I'll just leave that to the discussion. Thank you very much.
So, you know, that covers the topic pretty well. Everybody has the solution, passive first, mechanical second. What kind of questions could there be following that? Oh, good. I'll repeat the questions after I hear them. Is there a mic? Oh, yeah, use the mic, please.
Good afternoon. I was wondering, whenever I've suggested in my profession some green solutions, you always find that the appropriate profession isn't properly trained to deal with it. And so you have guys who refuse to do anything if it's not something that they've not done for the past 30 years. So, and there's also problems when you have new technologies, passive housing including, that people don't know how to use it properly, or that they built it incorrectly, which results in massive lawsuits, and therefore you have people resisting it. I think, please comment on this, how we can retrain the appropriate engineers and professionals to use these technologies appropriately. Because there is a bit of a timeline here with peak oil and the whole thing. Thank you.
That's really a question about information about this technology and the new inventions, or the old ones, for that matter. Who would like to answer
You
that?
want to repeat the question? No, I guess you don't. So she was able to speak the microphone.
Did everybody hear it?
So the question is how you approach this, when in fact many of these systems, or many of these approaches, including the passive systems, which are absolutely technology based and have to have strategies of moisture and air management, how you deal with the training for that. And this is actually a challenge for the architectural community, because the AIA has moved the architectural community to a point where you have an ethical responsibility to raise the opportunity for clients of these sustainability discussions, but it has not yet moved you to a point where you have a responsibility for building it into your buildings, which means that architects have exactly this challenge of where is the limit of my expertise, how does that match up against my insurance, and how does that match up with the fact that I may have told the client this is the way they should approach this, but it may exceed my ability to build all of those systems in. And the wonderful thing about the world of green and the world of the last few years of HERS training and a whole lot of training is there are a lot of resources, I think, that are available to integrate into these discussions. But the challenge has not been as much about finding the expertise. We can find the expertise, but it's about fitting it together. And, so you can find the expertise. I think the first training for architects right now needs to be the training of integration. And there are technology products, BIM and others, for focusing on the integration and being able to lead the others to it. It's going to take a while before there's an evenness of training across technologies, particularly with regard to dealing with the risk of new technologies and introducing technologies that may be right at the line as to whether they carry more risk than reward.
As for training, let me throw something in as well, and that is that so far as the training the user of a building, I would suggest to you that the thickness of a manual is inversely proportional to the life expectancy of the system. And that the highest standard is self-evident operation, where you actually need no manual at all.
I'd like to add to that, but let's get several questions on the floor, and then we'll come back maybe to topics.
I'll contradict that a little bit. I mean, if you think about it, a toaster oven comes with a thicker manual, but a house doesn't come with a manual, right? So. And having lived in an all-solar house, you had to operate the house. And we had to write a manual for that because after we lived in it, other people lived in it. And if you didn't operate the house correctly, you would get very cold at night, or you would dramatically overheat during the day. So one of the things we're insistent on in projects of any scale we're involved in is do a manual. It doesn't have to be more than about 8 or 12 pages, but explain what the building was designed to do. Tell people why this was designed this way and how to operate it, how to maximize your comfort in this building.
All right, so that will inspire me to go ahead with mine, which is we're talking about sophisticated buildings that are thought through in the first place to the degree that they might need a manual, require a manual. And we're talking about architects, which is really a small percentage of buildings that are built, and most people reside in houses or are using old commercial buildings for their businesses, which may not even have had an architect involved. Or if it is an existing building, then we don't have the privilege or to be starting from the beginning of being able to make decisions about either the architecture or the systems. So what about that part of the building fabric?
Well, but that's the wonderful thing that, the wonderful book, How Buildings Learn, we have such a huge building stock that needs us to turn back to it. And this notion I was advancing of our survival is dependent on efficient buildings. Well, we're not talking about new buildings. We're talking about a huge stock of existing buildings that we can't afford to tear down, that would be stupid for us, a waste and unsustainable. You have to respond.
Everything you've been showing has been new.
Well, that's because the discussion arises right now in the introduction of technology, but the fact of the matter is most of the engagement is on existing buildings. And, Steve started with the preservation, but if I'd known the discussion, I would have put up the Kansas City building in which they retrofitted the old post office for the IRS, built a new building next to it. They're LEED Gold, but the old building outperforms. Now, it didn't outperform when it was just an old building, but as modified, outperforms the new building. And this notion of taking both the tools that architects have of vernacular ways that humans have responded there and applying those and then figuring out the gap. I thought that was a good analysis, but that it came up pretty much every speaker talked about, okay, the market will define a gap. Once we leave the eco-warriors, the market will define there is some point that I want some intervention, or our machines define it. There are a number of ways that the gap occurs, and then we move to these efficient approaches. But I want to emphasize what Bill put on the table. When we're dealing with large-scale buildings, we exceed the ability for humans to have any manual right now. And this is one of the challenges. Heuristic analysis to keep the systems working so that we can actually achieve these things has to be done by computer. And so you want the challenge in this is, we are increasingly in data feedback loops that I'm not sure I believe that we need manuals for everything. We need manuals for the freaking rain gardens because people forget where they are, they don't know how to work them and all that. So even when we move to passive, we need manuals. But we're now going to need computers to do even the most basic elements.
So, Steve, this is really a setup for you to talk about buildings that don't need manuals.
Well,
perform. That's it. That perform. Don't need manuals and perform. That's the one that I'd love to talk about. Sure.
A classic example is the self-ventilating window, that's basically double hung so you can raise the bottom sash, lower the top sash. And then even in the cool of the day, the early evening, that warm air goes out of the top, cool air comes in at the bottom, even with no breeze whatsoever. Now, one time in a lifetime, a parent needs to tell a child that. And then from there on, there's no need for any further discussion because people simply know. And I mean, that's one classic example. There would be others, of course.
Which doesn't work in New Orleans because you train that child to do that, and they basically are going to destroy your energy efficiency, fill your house with mold. And so the point here is if you actually have a performance parameter on some of these things, some of the passive text, and it's the human part of that, because the human doesn't have enough information, and one of the ways to respond to this is to start giving more information that says, yes, this is a point where either the humidity is down or we're in a season where when I open that window, it's not going to close for 2 weeks.
Well, so, this is true. If
we were supposed to discuss, guys, so that's...
This is true if we insist on on behaving as we do now. You know, our tolerance of different conditions has shrunk to the least degree in human history. We have thermostat wars over 2 degrees on the thermostat, okay? And so long as we're going to be intolerant, and so long as we're going to use the materials we've used recently, like drywall, that it remains a wall so long as you keep it dry, but when you let it get wet, it turns to mush. You know, if we want to insist on that, then you're right. Then we do have to have highly sophisticated
But you
systems.
step back into the retrain the market discussion.
Yeah, and I don't get mold on I keep my windows open, my double hung windows open, and I have plaster walls, and mold doesn't grow on those lime plaster walls.
I could tell you that we're dealing with a building that almost 2 weeks after it opened, because they had bought into a not well thought through energy efficiency regime. Okay, so now we're talking about they were trying for the highest energy efficiency they could get, and they didn't track the humidity, and people said, oh, well, it's a nice pretty day. They put over the windows. The building within 3 weeks was unoccupiable.
So we're not going to ask you what else it was made of, because of Anne's comment, I think, gave us some, enlightened us on some of that. But let's pick up a few other questions. Diru, and the people who are raising their hands, maybe you should walk to the microphone.
Yeah, I just want to debunk Dan's comment about New Orleans, because Bombay has 100% humidity for 3 months, okay? And people have lived there without mechanical means for at least 2 centuries.
Right.
Okay? And we don't, we don't have the kind of mold problem that you're talking about. We do have it in some places, sure, when the wall gets wet. But with the double wall that we've been doing in India, which is two walls which are a meter apart, okay, the outside wall gets wet in that humidity. The channel of space between the 2 walls ventilates that wall. The inner wall never gets wet. It's at least 10 to 15 degrees cooler inside in a totally passive design, and it's been working really well for the last now 17 years with no complaints.
So what is the reason that if that was so marvelous and everybody understood that we didn't continue building that way, and so we turned to the narrow wall with drywall that gets mold?
Well, there used to be thicker walls previously with overhangs, okay? And the chhaja, the overhang, used to be made out of stone because it actually acted as a heat sink outside the building, so that the heat never really hit the wall. So if you look at any of, and Lutyens picked this up in New Delhi, and that's why those buildings have done so well, because the old traditional Mughal buildings wrapped the entire building, despite whether there were windows or not, with overhangs. And Dan, you've seen them. So it kept the heat out. And we just took that same system and made double walls with it. So the exterior wall now literally acts as a heat sink, and the heat doesn't transfer in. Also, I think you're discounting that people are resilient. Okay? You don't always have to be. You only have to be an American to think you need to live in 68 degrees. The rest of the world doesn't believe that. Okay? So I think that's the other part that...
I get to respond since he was debunking me. And I will point out that where he went was exactly where Steve went, which is, for this to be successful, all we have to do is retrain the market. Okay, well, that's not going to happen for quite some time. For quite some time. The market has proven dramatically resistant to being told, well, no, you abandon the air conditioner, abandon the heater, do these things. Now, should it end up there? Yeah. It's great. When you get that design in place and the market takes it up, then you can move forward. But right now, I can't go to a builder. I can't get them to do that. They're not going to go into the marketplace and say, hey, everybody, I've got a great design. You don't need an air conditioner at all. If we get there with all the pieces, I agree completely.
Well,
on the moisture
and on
side,
that score, the idea that you might make some models so that people really could see it is probably a good way to go. But let's get some other people
on the
in
moisture side of
Dan.
it, New Orleans is experiencing this. So you didn't debunk it. What happens is people put air conditioners in, and Anne's not all in New Orleans. New Orleans in new homes are experiencing it, and part of it is sort of marrying. It's getting halfway in with tight buildings and open windows. With the wrong materials.
So that's the catch-22. Next question.
Well, actually, it's a couple questions, points I'd like to make. One, I agree totally with Steve about conditioning people to the outside. I work a lot outside. I'm the town architect for a community up in the Panhandle. So I'm better off if I'd bump the thermostat up inside the house when I'm working outside, because if it's 90 outside and 80 inside, that's okay. If it's 90 outside and 68 inside, I'm miserable outside. The other thing is the mold issue. I think a lot of that is the unintended consequence of sealing the houses. And we need to deal with that. If it's a technological problem that probably needs to be dealt with technologically. In addition, people are going to open their windows when it's nice outside. And if that's a problem for the way the house works, then we need to rethink the way the house works.
Yeah, it has to do with the way it's built.
Yeah,
there's a response. You put a dehumidifier in, it's just more energy use that you have to do.
Well, so you're working against the purpose that you were sealing the house for.
I think we should also make it clear that there are big differences in scale. So the individual house, we're talking about the house that you might be able to control opening the windows and so on, versus the house that needs the manual. And then there's the large building, which has many people occupying it, whether it's offices or apartments, which has a whole other...
The large building that has a lot of people occupying it, the computer control systems are going to work there, except when the power goes out. And that was my third point. Any building, what happens when the power goes out? What happens when X disaster happens and it's unoccupied with no power for a week or 2 weeks or 3 weeks? Is the building occupiable when you get back there after the power's been out?
I think pretty much across the board in the green community, everybody sort of realized that. And Bill described some of the systems. Some of the other systems are basically when the power goes off, the windows become operable. There are a lot of responses.
And that doesn't work in a hurricane.
No, but you shouldn't be there in a hurricane.
Well, but you might not be back there.
No, but is the whole thing moldy when you come back 2 weeks later?
Yeah, the point is, can you occupy it when you get back?
Right.
Well, I think in our part of the world, what people are trying to do for residential tall buildings, if you do stay behind or if you come back, that the elevators are working. Because surprisingly, an apartment on an upper floor, even in the heat of summer, can be used if the systems are working. You may not have air conditioning, but if you can go up and down the building, you can...
If the building is sealed in a way that keeps you from opening...
Yeah, no, that's a whole other thing. But, I think we're getting right at the issue, which is that there is a series of multiple decisions that have to be taken in concert, and you don't always realize the whole chain of issues that work together that make something work.
So the Bank America Tower, when people moved in, we had to give them a manual. Because people's behavior in an office building is, we have several generations where you couldn't do anything to the space. So we had to give them a manual and give them training to let them know that they could open and close their blinds, that they could turn on and off their individual lights in their own offices, in their own spaces, because they were so used to the building doing it themselves. And the most radical one was that they could adjust the vents in their raised floors so they could adjust their own airflow and temperature. We had to train them because...
And how successful is that? Has anybody been monitoring behavior?
Yeah, no, we've been doing a lot of monitoring of behavior. And what we find is that, for instance, on the floor vents, people will mess with them for the first couple weeks or that, and then they'll get them at the level they want them. And then after that, they don't tinker with it much more. Mm-hmm. The blinds, once they get it up and down, the lights have been interesting, and in fact, what we're going to now is you'll see, the technology of occupancy sensors. The lights turn on when you come in the room. We're learning that that's actually take the same sensor and rewire it and make it a vacancy sensor. So the default is, because the building's a daylit building, so the default is when you walk in the room, lights are off. You want the lights on, you flick the switch.
Oh, imagine, an old-fashioned idea.
And so what we find, and then if you leave the office, that same occupancy sensor senses that, oh, no one's in here. Lights go off. What we find with that is that people will tend, because it's a well-daylit building, to not turn the lights on. And so the energy use is actually lower than we expected because you modeled the energy use as if people were turning those lights on. But it's that sort of difference between opt-in and opt-out, and a whole different way of thinking about operations of that. Give people the opportunity, but they have to make a choice to do it.
There would also probably be commonality on the if you can get to it, not having operating manuals on things. My client in New Orleans who does the thermos bottles, it sort of laughs at the new thermostat product that senses, what's going on around. His position is if the building is done correctly with geothermal and solar and the other elements in place, it pretty much maintains itself, and you shouldn't need to be adjusting. That it's going to be at a comfortable temperature, and it's those human interventions that actually waste energy.
So let's take a question from over here, and then I'll come back to the other mic.
I grew up in the Panhandle, and on the Gulf Coast, and I think the market is changing. I'm 20, and I grew up in a house that was not designed to be passive cooled, but 6 to 7 months out of the year on the Gulf Coast, we had no air conditioning or heating. And we also had hurricanes where we'd spend 3 weeks growing up every summer, it seemed like, with no real HVAC or heating, and of course no heating, but I think the market can stretch. It's more like the idea of comfort of the American people and the world, because if someone like me growing up on the Gulf Coast, I'm comfortable in 90% humidity, but you probably aren't, because you don't want to open the window even if it's nice out because you're afraid of the humidity in your house. But I find that's not necessarily something a bad thing. It's the resiliency of where you live is dependent.
It may have also something to do with age, since I grew up in Panama City, Florida, and plenty of humidity. And I think that the thing about markets is you have to be careful about saying we're going to change the market as much as figuring out ways to accomplish your goals and respond to what the market wants to do. And the HVAC industry has played with this a long time. They figured out this weirdness that somebody would walk in from 78 degrees and they would adjust their thermostat to 70 degrees. And they were trying to figure out why, because it didn't really make sense. And they decided that it was a mix of different factors, humidity, a breeze, a number of things. And they spent quite some number of years trying to figure out how to sell comfort instead of selling a temperature setting on the wall. And they haven't been successful with it, but it always seemed to me that was the right direction to be going to ultimately take advantage of that outside effect.
Yes.
I just wanted to point out that I think there's a cultural component to this as well. Culture has evolved in the context of these buildings, and people coming from northern countries, northern climates. I bought some clothing in India that was it was very lightweight material, and when you hold it up to the light, you can actually see right through it. And when I wore that, I realized that because I'd see all these people walking around with long sleeve shirts, long pants, and they seemed perfectly comfortable. And when I wore that, I realized it not only keeps the sun off the skin, it allows air movement through. It's like walking with tree shade all the time, But we, there were problems there when the British tried to impose their professional garb, there, and I feel like in the same way, I worked in North Carolina for a year. Everybody wore suits every day to the office, and they would keep the thermostats always at 68 or something. So I think as long as you're bringing clothing and culture that evolved in a northern cold climate, the building has to compensate for that. But if this isn't essentially a building problem, if this is a culture and in a way a clothing problem, if my job, if I'm going to work in a bank and I'm required to wear a suit every day, you want to wear a sports coat to a conference, then the building has to be air conditioned because you're going to have a heat stroke. So I wonder, part of this education campaign, there almost has to be a cultural shift in terms of, what can you wear? What's if I wore a lightweight shirt with, the top open, is that socially acceptable for the business that's going to be housed in this building? And
so the story to accompany that question, I think, is Miami-Dade County in the 70s, or the last time that people became concerned about energy costs. It was determined that it would be all right to wear a guayabera to work instead of, a simple shirt instead of a suit. And because the county decided it could change its thermostat from 68 to 72, and there would be some enormous savings as a result of that. and that happened. We probably could go up to 76 or 8 now, but we haven't done that yet. Hitting the pocketbook can be a very effective human behavior changer.
The Japanese have abandoned ties for a similar sort of reason. If you think about it, piling a whole bunch of material right on top of a human thermostat doesn't exactly make a lot of sense. And so it's absolutely.
Dan, one of the things I wanted to address was the market change. We don't change them, we have to compel them, right? We compel them to operate passively by virtue of making it easier. It's lowest hanging fruit theory, right? And part of that is eliminating the consequences of ventilating our houses naturally. You've hit on the humidity. It's not the fact that humidity destroys houses, it's the humidity destroys the houses the way we build them. Our systems, our tectonics are broken badly for what we want to do. We have to get rid of cavities. We have to do the things that will allow our buildings to withstand that big range of humidity and heat. And at the same time, make it easier, to open our homes without consequence. I hope it doesn't rain and I don't forget to close my window. Those silly little things that make it easier for us to operate on the passive system with the passive systems, but more specifically, eliminate the consequences, which are huge.
So that addresses the user, and I'd like to perhaps, this won't end the discussion, but help it continue, ask our panel 2 questions, one about large buildings and one about small buildings and the rest of the buildings that are out there. So there's one great Bank of America building in New York among, I would say, hundreds of pre-existing skyscrapers that now might have the benefit of that knowledge, and if you're monitoring the performance and so on. What about retrofitting those buildings? What have you learned from making this building with supposedly everything you would want to put into such a building that would be applicable to old buildings without, let's say, changing the skin?
Nice setup. Let me show, we're doing that right now on this.
And then I'm going to ask the same question about the 99% of houses in the country, or small, let's say not high-rise apartments, but small apartments that are in a similar condition. And someone else might answer that, but if you would do the big building.
Okay, so this is a building built by the Port Authority in the late 20s, early 30s. It's the same size as the Empire State Building, but it's laying on its side. It covers an entire city block, sidewalk to sidewalk. It was built as a warehouse. Trains and trucks came into this building. The trucks were put into elevators and taken up through the building. And the elevators are basically as big as a conference room. 2 of those elevators are still operational in the building. It's about 1/3 data centers. It is the biggest energy user in the state of New York. The electric bill is between $53 and $55 million a year. The water use of the building is similarly out of whack. And so our clients came to us with this building and said, what do we do with this thing? So let's do a little conversation. We're in the midst of an energy model right now, just to figure out the physics of the building. And I'm not going to go so much into that, but sort of what we did with the water. So this is the water use of the building. And what's intriguing about it is that the water coming out of the building is substantially higher than the water coming into the building. And we couldn't figure that out initially. And we started digging around and found 3 sump pumps in the lowest basement. And they seemed to be running all the time, and they've seemed to have been there since the building was built. And they're actually pumping 45 million gallons of water a year out of that building. The water's clear, cool, pretty pure. It's a stream. It's a stream that's been there. for 400 years. And so one of the projects we're heavily involved in is a project with the Wildlife Conservation Society called Mannahatta. And it's asking, what did this place look like in 1609 when Henry Hudson sailed into the bay? So here's today. There's 1609. And with Mannahatta, you can go in and you can type in your address on the island and find out what the ecosystem on your block was. And get a listing of the plant species, the geology, the hydrology, whether or not the Lenape Indians were resident on your site. And so we've taken this a step further and we said, okay, so if that's what the ecosystem was, what was it doing? And so here are the metrics. This is what the solar flux was. This is how much carbon was being sequestered. This is how many species were on the site. This is the water balance. This is the evapotranspiration. And then we ran those numbers for today. And so now the exploration is asking a really simple question. Can we think of urban fabric that performs from an ecological basis as well as what the indigenous ecosystem on the site did? And so that then becomes our frame of reference and our way of thinking about it. So one of the things that we're doing, here's what the water system is moving to. And along the way, while we're in the middle of this, Google was one of the tenants in the building, and they handed a check for almost $2 billion to our clients, bought the building. And Google wants, over the next 20 plus years, to turn this into a vertical campus with 12,000 people in the building. So if we continued the water systems as they are today, that end state would be 119 million gallons of water a year going into the building and 143 million gallons going out. That's not sustainable. That's ridiculous. So instead, what we're doing is saying we're only going to use the potable water for what it should be used for, kitchens and drinking. Everything else, we're going to use that stream that's been pumped out of the basement for almost 80 years, use that water, use the stormwater that falls on the building, reuse and clean up the gray water in the building. And so that would go to 26 million gallons purchased and 39 million gallons purchased. And so that comes from this idea of asking, what can we learn from what the ecosystem was doing on that place, and can we replicate those ecosystem services? Now, this also becomes a really, really localized conversation, because we're working on a building now up in Times Square that was red maple swamp. Up in East Harlem, it was a salt marsh. A block east of this, or a block west of this, you were on the shoreline of the Hudson. And so it becomes a way of thinking about solutions that's really, really localized. And so some of the systems in the building are, high ceilings. So we're looking at daylighting it. We looked at, could we add insulation to it without causing the brick to come apart if we got freeze-thaw on it. And so we actually have building scientists who've drilled into the walls, and we're monitoring the moisture transit across that envelope over the course of a year. All of those sorts of things. What we're finding is we probably might not add insulation to the building, but we are going to change the glass. We're going to upgrade the glass significantly and really work on getting that daylight deeper into the envelope of the building. The exterior will still look mostly the same, although since it goes sidewalk to sidewalk, we need outside spaces, so those terraces are all going to become gardens.
You know what I want to get to the small building before we break up, but what I take from that is that it's technology change rather than, let's say, structural change, and that there still needs to be a lot of work done because the degree of research and testing that you're doing on this building, presumably one cannot afford to do on every single building.
Right.
And so we're still in a learning phase in which getting a grant from Google to be able to do something like this will be useful in the future, but we don't have an easy answer yet.
We have our office in partnership with Cook Plus Fox and other organizations is doing a set of manuals for the Municipal Art Society on what do you do with the thousands and thousands of historically designated buildings in the city? What are acceptable greening measures that do not destroy the historic character of those buildings, but improve their performance?
So
we're
Liz,
committed to
stay
that.
tuned.
The context for that is also, though, if you look at New York has passed a law that requires those buildings to begin reporting what their actual energy use is. And so this is one of the important drivers and that begins focusing on building performance and turns it into value. So we have to simultaneously track the, not doing things that impact the visual value of the building, but truly performance now becomes an open source piece of information.
So lots of experts. About face to the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s tract house, I'm not talking McMansion, but kind of normal American house that's all over the country in which somebody owns it and is not going to hire an architect or an expert and is just looking for ways, let's say they've bought into these goals and ideals. What's out there, and they're not going to do a LEED thing. What's the condition of the information for that? Because it's really about information. You have to know what your goal is. How does the homeowner?
Unfortunately, there's a huge gap. In the last few years, there's been a lot of money thrown at exactly the way you raised, and a lot of it has been spent on a sort of marker of trying to accomplish 30% better than existing performance with about $10,000. The problem is that in most of those buildings, existing performance was already so much worse than code that 30% doesn't even bring them to a comparable level of a new code house's energy efficiency in its application. And there's a gap if you're just using the mechanisms that people have brought into the marketplace right now. There's a big gap on getting reliable performance out of retrofit of existing buildings,
But I don't even think it's a gap in the gap begins with a gap in communication, in knowledge and information for the do-it-yourselfer, right?
Well, the gap in that maybe they shouldn't spend $10,000 on such poor achievement. The problem is if you look at taking some of these same circumstances and rethinking them and saying, if I'd spent this money on aggregating that money and doing a photovoltaics or something else that got to my problem a different way, I might have approached it instead of trying to drive energy efficiency, trying to create a better neighborhood energy source that didn't have adverse consequences.
I think that's probably even beyond most individuals. But we've raised a few more questions, so maybe we could keep going for a few more minutes.
I was just thinking about what you were just talking about previously, and just one comment might be that it might not be feasible for individuals to retrofit their houses, and maybe that's a place where we need to give people aid from a town, state, or federal level. And maybe that's the right way to go about providing that information, and then also maybe providing some of the resources. But my question actually came up a little bit earlier, but I think applies to small buildings. I was just wondering if any of you, people have been keeping warm, cool, or dry on this continent for a lot longer than there have been cities here. And I'm wondering if any of you have experimented with any kind of building materials that are more earthen or passive solar in that way, not necessarily in a more technological way, but in a less technological way.
That's interesting. I'll talk about that because we did in the UK this summer work with wattle and daub construction, which of course bousselage was used historically in Louisiana and on the Gulf Coast, which is mud and horsehair mixed together, within a wood frame. And there's been discussion about whether or not we should start looking at that again as well. Again, with the lime plaster, covered in lime plaster. There are buildings still in the French Quarter that have been there for, over 200 years. I would like to add something else too. I'm thinking that there is the air-conditioned building, Tom, where we had really good building materials, mostly sometimes 100-year-old wood, like cypress, which we have, but different woods around the country. When the building materials were more natural, and we did heat and cool our homes and our buildings in a much more sustainable way. And then we have the 1940s, 50s that Liz was talking about, a whole era. So I think that there are going to have to be a whole set of solutions for each one of those. I think the historic buildings preservationists are saying, look, learn to use curtains on your windows, for goodness sakes. Don't paint that double hung window at the top. Everybody does that. The painters go in and they paint that closed, so you can't open it.
So Anne, in our region, there is a large house in Miami called Vizcaya, which had very valuable furnishings, antiques that it brought over from Europe, but it was made entirely of masonry, and it did have a heating system. It had a duct heating system. This is a house that was built at the beginning of the 20th century, so air conditioning did not yet exist. And what they understood was that once a year they had to close the house and heat it. So any mold that had accumulated was killed by heating the house during the summer months for some period of time. Next question.
So I just wanted to mention on the topic of historic buildings and energy performance. So there's a group out in Seattle called the Preservation Green Lab, which is a branch of the National Trust for Historic Preservation. They're doing some great work on looking at potential model energy codes for historic buildings, and they also just recently published a report on the value in terms of carbon footprint of maintaining an existing historic building rather than creating new construction. So I just wanted to point out that resource that would be great for folks to take a look at.
Thank you.
Hi, Scott Bernstein. Going back to your point, Liz, about the cost of acquiring the information needed at different scales, we have a tool available that people might be interested in called My Home EQ.
Called My Home
EQ.
EQ.
Energy quotient. And what it does is what we did was we entered into a relationship with local utilities, first in Chicago and then in 5 other regions. In Chicago, we got the utilities to agree to share a copy of their billing database for alternative years over a decade. And then we have other building information, area takeoffs and so forth available from county assessors. And so we're able to simulate 85% of the information by constructing building types based on real information that we would get from a more detailed audit. So a $3,000 to $5,000 inspection can be simulated for a trivial amount of money. Now, if we needed to get down to the questions that are being debated here about passive versus active approaches, then we at least have a baseline of comparability of type to type, and we could do something like a form-based code for building types off of that, but there's no getting around the need to actually have the baseline of the energy use by building type to begin with. So the good news is, under certain conditions, you can get utilities for research purposes or market development purposes to share that information, and we've created a 6-city consortium of MLSs working with us and the National Association of Realtors to make this sort of the first component of a green MLS, and to be followed later by transportation and foreman and so forth. And I think there might be some applicability to this kind of discussion. Whereas for Bill's building, which I'm in awe of this analysis on, I'm not sure there's a second one. So you learn a lot about what you could do at a neighborhood scale here by looking at something in which a neighborhood is in effect, or a job center wrapped up in a single building, and that might give us some other insights for different ways to go after energy districts. I don't know what you think about that, Bill, but
they're doing that in New Orleans.
Scott, we're actually doing a project with Wildlife Conservation Society with some funding from Rockefeller and Summit to do these numbers for all the ecosystems of Manhattan. So you could actually go in on the website and not only get what the ecosystem was, but all the ecosystem services that were being provided there. So you could get this as an understanding. And, for us, it's not so much an absolute as it's a way of sort of reframing some of the conversation. So it's not about, am I 30% better than what ASHRAE standard, which gets really arbitrary really fast, but just sort of asking a question of, can I design something that performs as well as what the indigenous site was capable of doing? And that takes you also to a completely technology agnostic approach as well. It's not about technology, it's about sort of asking questions about place and where I am.
You also shouldn't lose track of one of the advantages that cities may have over suburbs in this, and that is when we talk about aggregation and we talk about district energy systems, there's a lot of excess heat in cities, particularly cities that still have industrial uses. There's a lot of things we're wasting in the system that including heat off the sewers, that other cities are beginning to capture and use that may actually answer that question in a different way. Instead of running into the problem of insulating an old house, what if in fact we use the waste heat that's available and attack the problem in a way that doesn't need the resources applied to the house, but gives them cheap energy from being in the city itself. So I think there are more ways to skin this cat than just attack each building individually.
Doug?
Yeah, I just wanted to say two things and then ask a question. First of all, there are a number of new urbanists here precisely because they were passive solar architects in the 70s and 80s. And we realized that we were doing a bunch of freestanding solar houses, compensating essentially for stupid land use practices and policies, and the party wall was better than the solar wall or the Tron wall or whatever. That's literally why some of us are in new urbanism. But I want to get to the behavior issue, which Liz, you sort of referred to the pocketbook issue and how that changes behavior, and I loved your idea of the vacancy sensor around the occupants. I mean, that's the sort of thinking that we need. Jevons paradox is getting a lot of press and airtime right now. Jevons paradox is, you increase efficiency and you end up using more of a given material or a given energy. I think most people are familiar with it now. It's not clear how much it applies to energy behavior. People like Amory Lovins don't think it applies that much. It's like 20-30% of the full factor. Others think it's a big debate. There's a lot of literature on it. And I'm pondering, and I'm wondering if you can help me. I'm not sure. We know for automobile behavior, gas price and efficiency of vehicles makes a big difference. What about building efficiency? As you increase it more, are people just going to keep that thermostat even lower and for longer into the fall or earlier in the spring because it's cheaper and cheaper, more efficient systems? Or are they really going to change their behavior? Unless the price goes up, I don't think people are going to change. And the Himmel Theater wouldn't be at 49 degrees as it was yesterday if energy was more expensive. So do you think Jevons paradox fully applies to this sort of discussion and for buildings more than, say, automobiles?
Where we see you see some of the rebound effect on the lowest income, on some of the lowest income stuff, where people are having to make the choice between food and fuel. And you'll see some rebound there. Which makes sense. I mean, if they can get some more level of comfort. Rebound is if you make things more efficient, will people use more energy? If you make energy systems a lot more efficient, won't they just get more and more stuff and eventually eat up that efficiency? There's evidence for that at the various low income where people are having to make the food versus fuel choice. You get a slight rebound in that, their energy use does go up a little bit. And that's been studied for quite a while, and it actually makes sense. I mean, people are wanting to be comfortable and all that, and I'll give them that. So that's fine. But on the larger system, not so much. I mean, people are going to, if they're used to a temperature band, they're going to, whether the system's more efficient or not, they're pretty much going to stick with that. But on a house, for us, the basics is, get the house so it can be as comfortable as possible without having to have the system, and then the system is an addition to that. You know, and that means that that system will not have to do as much work as it did before. So, you know. Yeah. I mean, what we are getting is that it's not so much. What we're getting is people are just putting more stuff into houses and all that. So
that's it. It's 70% more efficient in New Orleans. The other stuff in the house is using more energy than the heating and cooling of the house. So the equation changes where stuff drives it instead of heating and cooling.
Two more, and then we'll invite the conversations to happen individually when we'll shut down the panel.
Yeah, I think the previous questioner, I mean, the basic problem is that energy is too cheap. I mean, you're talking about the 99% of the homes. There's just no question that energy is too cheap. So therefore, the cheapest solution is to just leave the thermostat there, or accept that, you know, the norm is 72 degrees, the entire house heated, independent of whether it's occupied or not. And this, by the way, is a unique American standard. In Japan, they don't have central heating. In the winter, you put on a sweater. I mean, that is, behavior has a huge impact, probably the most important impact on energy consumption that there is. I just completed an independent school, and the head of the student body stood up and said, you know, I can't believe what energy waster my parents are. You know, all the kids in this school are totally behind a green building. We want to have solar collectors on it. That's a wonderful idea. Well, it took the physics teacher one homework assignment to demonstrate that if the school uniform included a sweater in winter, they would save more power than an entire solar collector on all of the roof area of the building, just by requiring a sweater as part of the student dress package. And I mean, I think the lesson there is just so clear, and that is that a very small change in behavior, when you travel, if you go to India, I just got back from India, you go to India after 2 days, your body re-norms. And at 80 degrees is not hot anymore.
Because everybody's hot together.
Everybody's hot. It's not bad. And it's nothing that needs fixed. Our problem is that we've been told that there's a problem that needs fixed.
So another local lesson might be in Dade County, I don't know the exact statistics and timing, but with population growth that has occurred in the last decade, apparently we have drastically reduced water consumption. And that has to do with a number of items. There's a regulation about how much you can irrigate. You know, toilets have to be a certain way, and shower heads and the mixer on the shower. There's only one type, apparently, that you can buy unless you leave the state to buy your plumbing fixtures. Enough things have been done that are not so much behavior-based, although they change behavior, that have to do with regulations and products, that it has made a difference, a measurable difference. So it would be interesting to see. There's another program in the state of Florida in which, but each town and city has to opt into it. I think it's called PACE. Is that something that's happening in other parts of the country where you can change your tax structure in exchange for taking energy savings measures in your house. And in a sense, the municipality is allowing you to use your tax money over some period of years to pay off that energy change, and then your tax structure goes back after whatever it is, 5 or 10 years. So there's some very clever inducements like that that could be policy-based, that then I think the individual homeowners would learn about very quickly to take advantage of. But I still think the information out there is tough. You know, that light bulb thing. I still don't know what to do.
So I don't think price signal is the way to do it. And here's why. Some of the most efficient buildings in the country are in the Pacific Northwest. with the cheapest utility rates in the country. Some of the most inefficient buildings in the country are in Hawaii and Puerto Rico, where people are paying 28 cents to 30 cents a kilowatt hour. What we're finding is it's really it's a cultural thing. And so we're involved in this process with the Garrison Institute and others on climate mind and behavior. And there's this new branch of neuroscience called neuroeconomics, started in Germany, and it was really looking at how people are making decisions. And what they wanted to measure was, the old economic theory said that decisions were made either on fear or desire. And there's this whole other set of decisions that people seem to be making that didn't kind of fit that. They looked really weird. It was keeping up with the Joneses sort of stuff. That wasn't fear or desire. And so they went in and they watched what people's brains were doing when they were making these decisions. And when they were making fear-based decisions, it was base stem of the brain, and it was something that generated all these endocrines that eventually you either go into denial or your behavior changes pretty radically negatively. With desire, it's endorphin flows and stuff, and it works briefly, and then you want the next thing. Then they discovered that what hadn't been realized before is that when you are doing stuff based on what your peer group is, peer group affiliation, turns out it's a whole different section of the brain that's operating. And it doesn't, when you're in that mode, you don't get the exhaustion that you get with fear or with desire. And so the biggest innovations going on right now in climate change behavior and looking at that, and even utility policy, are things where you give people feedback, and it's feedback within a context of their peer group. So there are a bunch of utility companies that will give you, when you get your bill, they give you a comparison to what your neighbors were doing. And what they find is when they do that, suddenly it's not about your absolute kilowatt hours. It's like, oh my God, my neighbors down the street who have the same house as me are using a third less energy than me. Ugh, right? And so it becomes this peer group affiliation stuff. That seems to have been the most effective, right now, one of the most effective stuff going on in getting people to lower their energy use.
You know, on that note, I think I should cut it off. Dan has to go on to the next session, as I'm sure many of you do, but maybe this conversation could continue off mic for the next few minutes. I don't know if the room is about to be used again, but thank you everyone for participating. Some very interesting information being produced by our panel. Let's give them a hand. Thank you.